Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is the last day of December, December 31st, and it's day 86. Today, I'm not going to give an update on what's happening on the ground. I'll give more news about that tomorrow. There are no major changes, except for some troops are being removed from Gaza. Some Israeli troops, in terms of the ground incursion, are being removed from Gaza. So I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Today, because it's Sunday, I wanted to spend a little bit of time answering a question that I received from someone who watches these videos. They sent me a note and they said, it's hard for me to see and to understand God's heart for Gaza after I read Zephaniah chapter 2. It talks about the destruction of Gaza. And so the question was about this passage in the Hebrew scriptures, Zephaniah chapter 2, and how can we understand what's happening right now in Gaza in light of that passage? So I thought I would read just a few of those verses, Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. This section is called Philistia, and it says this: Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon left in ruins. At midday, Ashdod will be emptied and Ekron uprooted. Woe to you who live by the sea, you Kerathite people. The word of the Lord is against you, Canaan, the land of the Philistines. He says, I will destroy you and none will be left. The land by the sea will become pastures, having wells for shepherds and pens for flocks. The land will belong to the remnant of the people of Judah, and there they will find pasture, and in the evening they will lie down in the houses of Ashkelon, and the Lord will care for them, and he will restore their fortunes. Now, that's a very short passage in the broader context of Zephaniah, and it's important to understand that Zephaniah is one of 12 books that are called the Minor Prophets. Those are actually some of the least studied books in the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, at least for Christians. And I won't go into great detail, but the main themes of the Minor Prophets have a tendency to be about God's mercy and God's judgment. God's covenant and relationship with the Jewish people, the Israelites, or the Hebrews of the Old Testament. And the Minor Prophets often talk about the day of the Lord, the day of God's judgment. The Jewish people were often disobedient, and God was talking about their punishment and the day of reckoning, the day of the Lord's judgment. But then also the Minor Prophets talked about the coming of the Messiah. This section that I just read in chapter 2 of Zephaniah is referring to the Gentiles, who were the Western enemies of the Israelites. It was talking about the Philistine cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron in verses 4 through 7, the Western enemies of the Israelites. And the destruction described in this passage, I think it's really important for us to understand it's talking about a specific time and place. And I would argue that it's talking about specifically in the time and place in which it's written. This was not meant to be a prophetic writing speaking of 2014 or 2023, but God was calling on the Jewish people during this time who were living under King Josiah's reign in Judah, which was roughly 640 to 609 BC. And he was calling the people to be obedient. And not only in Zephaniah does he say that he'll destroy Gaza, but in the first chapter of Zephaniah, he says that he will destroy everything, even the whole world. The message of Zephaniah was comprehensive. And the prophet says in chapter 1, verse 2, and he's telling the story of what God will do if the people are not obedient, where chapter 1 of Zephaniah, verse 2 says, I will sweep everything away from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. So if we're going to pick some passages from the Old Testament and say those apply to today, then we can't pick and choose some, we have to pick and choose them all. The kings before Josiah had led the people astray. And so the people during this time were worshiping false gods. They were practicing idolatry, even in the temple. They were engaging in pagan music and other acts of disobedience. And so chapter 2 in Zephaniah was talking about the destruction of Gaza in light of that context. And when we read the entire book of Zephaniah, we see that God not only promises the destruction of Gaza, but the destruction of the whole earth if people are not obedient and return to him. And And I don't have time to go through an entire exegesis of the book of Zephaniah or the minor prophets, but I do feel like we see these patterns throughout the prophets of an opportunity and an invitation of the people of God to be restored to God, but we even see glimpses of that invitation to the Gentiles. And we see that here as well. The first 3 chapters of Zephaniah talk about the judgment of God, but not only against the enemies of God, but also against God's people, the Israelites, for their disobedience. And I talked about what that was about, worshiping false gods, etc. It's what the book calls the first and second grievous day, and that's through chapter 3, verse 8. But then the book talks about this glorious day, chapters 3, verse 9 through 20, where God promises the faithful remnant, those who return to him, he will take away their punishment and will also turn back their enemies. Their enemies will not triumph against them. And then chapter 3, verse 9 might even indicate this invitation to Gentiles that were not yet a part of the people of God to be invited in. That verse says, then I will purify the lips of the peoples, not just God's people, but all people, that all of them may come to call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. And so we see this glimpse of this invitation to the Gentiles that becomes much, much more prolific in the New Testament when we think about Peter going to Cornelius's house, or we see, the church in the New Testament with Paul being extended to the Gentiles as well. So what does that mean? A few thoughts. In view of the Old Testament passages of destruction, that we must view these passages in the context. If we're going to take this passage to mean the destruction of Gaza today, you have to take all of the passages of the Hebrew scriptures literally. And I don't think we're willing to do that, because even in Zephaniah, it talks about the destruction of the entire world. I think we have to look at Zephaniah and the minor prophets and the Hebrew scriptures in light, for those of us who choose to follow Jesus, who identify as Christian, in light of the New Testament. How do we read these in light of the teachings of the New Testament scriptures, where there are opportunities for Gentiles to call on the name of the Lord? And we see, as I mentioned, I think a glimpse of that invitation here. When we look at the entirety of the New Testament and the story of the person of Christ, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that we see throughout the New Testament a love for the entire world, not a love only for one people group. And we see this throughout a number of verses throughout the New Testament. Matthew 5:43 talks about the love of God, the love of neighbor, and the love of enemy. And when we look at the commandments in the New Testament of how we're supposed to respond to people in the world, we see those commandments extended to all people as well, not only to believers or not only to people who choose to follow God. Luke chapter 6, verse 27 says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. So when we look at that in light of the bombing of Gaza today, and we look at that in light of what's happening in Israel and what's happening in terms of this war, what does it mean to love your enemies and to do good to those who hate you and to bless those who curse you? And I would say that the 2+ million people in Gaza, we have to remember, the vast majority are civilians. They are not Hamas. They did not perpetrate the attacks on October 7th, and they are facing the consequences for the horrors of those attacks. Galatians 5, we should live by the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness. Galatians 6:10 says, let us do good to all people, not just to some people. It doesn't say just do good to people who, live in our neighborhood or who practice the same religion we do. Hebrews 12:14 talks about pursuing peace. And 1 Peter 3:9 is the last passage that I wrote. Do not repay evil for evil, or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to do this you were called, and in that you will obtain a blessing. There is not a doubt in my mind. God's heart is broken for what's happening in Gaza. God's heart is broken for what's happening in Israel. What's happening right now, violence is not of the heart of God. We see this when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the disciples thought that he was going to take the kingdom by sword, and he said, "Violence begets violence." We see this even in the cross, where Jesus forgives those who were convicted of murder, who were, next to him and were being crucified, and he says, "You're forgiven." Today, the death tolls are more than 20,000 people in Gaza who are not Hamas, more than 1,200 people in Israel, the majority civilians, more than 8,000 children killed in Gaza, 36 Israeli children have been killed. There are more than 100 people still held hostage in Gaza. And every day, here is the situation, every day more people are dying. More civilians in Gaza are dying, and there is a devastating humanitarian crisis there. More Israeli soldiers are being killed, and then the 100 people who continue to be held hostage. The killing must stop, and we must call for a ceasefire now. There is no way that a God of love and a God of justice and a God of mercy would call and support the killing and what's happening in Gaza now. So call for a ceasefire. I wanted to close with a poem that was shared with us. I got permission to receive this. It's a poem for Christmas. This was written by Laura Martin, one of the pastors at Rock Spring United Church of Christ. They're a partner of Churches for Middle East Peace. We're so grateful for their support of our work. And this poem was written by Pastor Laura Martin, a poem for Christmas this year. The angels wear flak jackets and helmets as they sing. Like the press corps, their voices astonishing louder than the war sounds. They could have stayed away this year, taken an easier assignment, cashed out their annual leave. But their angel ancestors also sang to a world of war and military occupation, and told them it is precisely the shattered world that needs their song. Below them, the shepherds, like all of us, are afraid. And the hospital where Mary planned to deliver has been bombed. So she seeks alternate accommodations. The angels sing on, even as their faces are wet with tears. To Mary and the shepherds, and also to those who let bombs fall, the light is born. To the donkeys with their worn hooves, to the oxen with their furs smelling like the fields, to the wolf and the lamb, the light is born. To Joseph, who isn't sure whose version of the story to believe, the light is born. To the lost and to the lonely and to the overcome, the light is born. To the grieving, the light is born. To those with arthritis and sore backs and bad knees, to those with anxieties and with chronic illness, to those who never sleep through the night, the light is born. To those in the rubble and to those in the mansions, the light is born. To us, the light is born so that we might believe that we are a part of it too, so that we might believe that the broken world has been overturned before and it will be overturned again. Not by battle, but by peace. Not by hatred, but by love. Not by despair, but by commitment. Not by power, but by justice. Not by denying the angels the chance to sing in the depths of this night, but by making room and singing alongside of them. With the love that forms us, sustains us, and never lets us go. May it be so as we work for peace and call for a ceasefire in the name of Christ. Amen.